a small town in the U.S., a secluded house draws in residents who are never seen again. With a history shrouded in ancient secrets, the house is known for slowly draining the soul of anyone who crosses its threshold. When a lonely and emotionally devastated young woman inherits the property from a distant relative, she sees it as an opportunity for a fresh start. But as she steps through its dusty hallways and echoing rooms, she begins to realize that the house has plans of its own. Despair slowly sets in as the memories of those who lived there before begin to merge with her own mind. Here, the house never lets its secrets die, and it never lets its residents leave. The narrow, winding road seemed to stretch endlessly before Mia, the muffled sound of tires on the old asphalt echoing in her mind. The lifeless gray sky seemed to mirror her thoughts, and the silence inside the car was as oppressive as the weight of the memories she was trying to forget. At 28, Mia felt like her life was sinking into emotional quicksand from which there was no escape. What remained of her family, whom she hadn't seen in years, had disappeared after a series of tragedies, leaving her alone, vulnerable, with nothing to hold on to. The phone call she received weeks ago had been a shock. A house had been left to her. A distant relative, someone she barely remembered, had died, and with no other heirs, the old property had been left in her name. It was a house in the hills in a small, unknown town. For Mia, it seemed like the only chance to escape her crumbling life. The idea of starting over in such a distant place felt promising. She had nothing left to lose. As the house appeared on the horizon, a towering, lonely structure perched atop a hill, a chill ran down her spine. The air around her seemed denser, as if the atmosphere was charged with a presence Mia couldn't quite place. The property was surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to close in around the house, like a suffocating embrace of twisted trees. Stepping out of the car, Mia took a closer look at the house. The old, dusty windows seemed like eyes watching her, while the moss-covered and vine-draped walls whispered long-forgotten secrets. Each creaking board on the porch let out a faint, almost imperceptible groan, as if the house was alive, subtly breathing. As she opened the heavy front door, the smell of mold and dampness hit her immediately. The air inside was thick, oppressive, and seemed to carry with it the memories of generations past. The entryway was wide, with an old wooden staircase spiraling upward, like a coil leading into the unknown. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the sound of her footsteps echoing off the walls. Mia explored each room, noting the antique furniture covered in time-yellowed sheets. The house seemed suspended in a state of both abandonment and preservation, as if time didn't flow the same way there. When she reached the kitchen, she found a pile of old letters scattered across the wooden table. Curious, she picked up one of the letters. It was dated 1954, handwritten by someone named Margaret. The words spoke of despair, loneliness, and the oppressive weight the house placed on its residents. Night fell quickly, and the house, already suffocating in the daylight, became an even more unsettling presence under the cover of darkness. The dim lights barely illuminated the hallways, casting long shadows that danced on the walls, as if something was lurking, waiting. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle in their rusty frames. Mia decided to settle in the master bedroom upstairs. The large, old bed seemed inviting, despite the cold air that filled the room. As she lay down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The house's silence was different. It was dense, heavy, as if something was lurking in the walls, just watching. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When she finally drifted off, She was consumed by vivid nightmares. She found herself trapped in endless corridors that stretched and twisted, like a maze with no end, the walls pulsing as if they were alive. Voices whispered her name in the distance, calling to her, drawing her deeper into something she couldn't see. When she woke, her body was drenched in cold sweat, and the house around her seemed darker, more oppressive than before. The windows were covered in a thick fog that shouldn't have been there, given the dry weather. The feeling of discomfort only grew. Mia got out of bed and wandered through the house, aimlessly, but with the clear sense that she was being watched. Every step echoed strangely, as if someone or something was following close behind. When she reached the end of the second-floor hallway, she found a locked door, one she hadn't noticed before. It was a heavy door with old locks. For some reason, Mia felt a strong pulse in her temples, a silent warning that she shouldn't open that door. But, unable to resist the growing curiosity and irrational impulse, she searched for the key. When she unlocked the door, the stench of decay filled the air, and the room before her was completely dark, except for a faint flicker of light in the corner, like a candle on the verge of going out. As Mia stepped inside, she felt a presence. Something was in the room with her. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it in every fiber of her being. Something ancient, something trapped, waiting for its moment. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and darkness consumed her. The darkness was absolute, impenetrable, and the air inside the room felt different, denser, as if it were alive, pulsing around Mia. Her heart pounded uncontrollably, and a wave of panic began to rise from her chest, tightening her throat. She groped at the walls in search of a switch, but the surfaces were cold and rough, almost damp to the touch. No light came on. The faint flame that had seemed to flicker in the corner of the room had completely vanished. She wasn't alone. The sensation was visceral, almost like an electric current crawling beneath her skin. Every inch of that place carried an invisible presence, something ancient and hungry. Mia tried to swallow her fear, forcing herself to breathe slowly. But something was wrong. The room felt larger than it should have been, much larger. It was as if the walls had receded, or maybe they had never been there. Suddenly, sounds began to emerge from the darkness. At first, they were soft whispers, almost incomprehensible. But as Mia strained to listen, they grew louder, clearer. Intertwined voices, speaking in unison, all murmuring her name. Mia, Mia, Mia. She recoiled instinctively, her back hitting the door. She tried to turn the knob, but it felt as though the lock was jammed from the inside, refusing to budge. Desperation seeped into her thoughts, slowly replacing any remnants of rationality. She was trapped, caught. The voices grew louder, a cacophony that filled the space around her, echoing inside her mind. They spoke of pain, of loss, of suffering that transcended time. "We were here before you, and we will be here after," they seemed to say. "You belong to us now." The pressure in her head intensified, and her vision began to distort. The walls that had once seemed to expand now appeared to be closing in on her, compressing her. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was an entity, something tangible that crawled toward her, slowly approaching. She felt the cold touch of something on her ankle, like invisible fingers dragging across her skin, trying to pull her into the depths of the darkness. "This isn't real," Mia whispered to herself, repeating it like a mantra. "This isn't real." But the words felt empty, powerless. Something deep inside her knew that the house was warping her perception of reality. It knew that the line between what was real and what wasn't was unraveling, like a thin web breaking at the slightest touch. Then suddenly the voices stopped. Silence returned, but it was a suffocating silence, loaded with the promise of something worse. A knock, slow and firm, echoing through the void of darkness. Mia felt her heart stop for a second. Someone was knocking on the door. With trembling hands, she turned the knob once more, this time with success. The door swung open abruptly, revealing the dimly lit hallway outside. The sense of relief was immediate, but brief. The hallway looked different. The lights flickered faintly, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. The old paintings that adorned the corridors now seemed distorted, their faces twisted into expressions of silent terror. Mia ran down the hallway, her hands gliding along the walls as she tried to guide herself. But the space seemed to twist around her. She turned left, then right, but never reached the end of the corridor. It was as if the house was moving, rearranging its interior to confuse her. Panic surged again, leaving her breathless. At last, she reached the main hall where the front doors should have been. But to her horror, the doors had disappeared. Where an exit should have been, there was only a solid wall, as if the house was slowly closing in, swallowing her whole. Mia screamed, pounding her fists against the walls, but the sound of her blows echoed into nothingness. Then, she felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Like a silent tremor, the ground seemed to ripple, twisting in an unnatural way. She stumbled and fell to her knees, her hands touching the floor, which now felt warm, as if something was alive just beneath the surface. A wave of revulsion filled her stomach, and she recoiled, feeling the air around her vibrate with an invisible energy, an ancient and uncontrollable force. The house wasn't just a place, it was alive. The sense of losing control was overwhelming. Every thought seemed to fragment, and the notion of time began to fade. She had no idea how long she had been in that place. Hours? Days? Weeks? The clock on the wall spun erratically, its hands moving at random, mocking her inability to escape. With each passing second, Mia felt her mind unraveling, as if the house was draining her sanity. Visions of distorted faces and bodies dragged by shadows filled her mind. She saw people she didn't know, but she felt a connection to them. They were lost souls, trapped in the house, just as she was now. They watched her, waiting for her next move. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Laughter, low and raspy, echoing through the walls. It wasn't ordinary laughter. It was a sound laced with malice, pure contempt, and it came from everywhere at once. Mia collapsed to the floor, covering her ears, trying to block out the sound, but the laughter only grew louder. The voices had returned, this time speaking clearly. "You will never leave. This is your home now." Her thoughts were fragmented, and a terrible truth began to emerge. She realized the house wasn't just trying to possess her. It was trying to become a part of her, absorbing every fragment of her existence until she was nothing more than a shadow, a memory trapped forever in that cursed place. Mia barely recognized herself anymore. Days, weeks, or perhaps months seemed to have passed since she became trapped in the house. Time no longer made sense. Each day blended into the previous one, with no clear distinction between what was a dream and what was reality. Her body was weak, her skin pale, and dark circles hung under her eyes, as if her vitality was being slowly drained. The house, like a patient predator, was absorbing every piece of her soul, bit by bit, while she wandered lost through its endless corridors. The reflection in the mirror wasn't hers, at least not anymore. Staring at her own reflection, Mia saw a woman who looked like a stranger. Disheveled hair, vacant and disoriented eyes, features marked by a darkness that came from within. But there was something more, something beyond her reflection. A shadow, indistinct and hazy, lingered behind her in the mirror, always present but never clearly defined. With a sudden impulse, she turned around, expecting to see something, someone. But the room was empty. The mirror, however, showed the shadow more clearly now. A tall and slender figure, always lurking, silently watching her every move. Fear gripped her chest like an invisible hand. No matter where she went in the house, the shadow was always there, haunting her steps. As Mia roamed the house, she realized that its memories were beginning to blend with hers. Not just the old letters she had read or the whispers in the walls, but vivid images of other lives, other people who had lived and died there. In disturbing flashes, she saw families dining, children running through the halls, parties in long-forgotten rooms. But at the core of every memory, there was always a presence. The same shadow always watching, as if it were the house's dark guardian. A pattern began to emerge in her mind. Everyone who entered that house never left. Their lives fused with the walls, their stories intertwined with the house's fabric until they were nothing but echoes, ghosts trapped in an eternal cycle. The house fed on them, consuming their souls and keeping them captive forever. But why her? What did the house want from her? The thoughts echoed like a hammer inside her head. She tried to focus, to organize her thoughts, but every time she seemed close to an answer, the house would twist her mind again, plunging her into another wave of confusion and terror. One particularly silent night, the sound of a soft whisper woke her from a state of stupor. "Come," the voice murmured, almost like a sweet, inviting call, yet laden with sinister intent. The voice seemed to come from all directions, filling the space around her. Unable to resist the command, Mia rose and followed the sound, descending the spiral staircase that wound down to the basement. The darkness enveloping the basement was almost tangible, like a thick cloak that suffocated the dim candlelight. The air was even heavier there, almost damp, laden with an ancient and malevolent energy. Each step she took echoed ominously, as if the wooden floor was alive, watching her, waiting. In the center of the basement, she found something she hadn't noticed before. A small, weathered wooden door embedded in the stone floor. It was slightly ajar, and a faint breeze wafted from within, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Mia hesitated, feeling a visceral fear rising inside her, but the whisper urged her, irresistible. "Enter. You need to see." She knelt and fully opened the door. Below, a stone staircase descended into the depths, plunging into what seemed like an endless abyss. The cold that emanated from that place penetrated her bones, and Mia knew that this was the source of everything. The beating heart of the house, the place where all its horrors were born. Without control over herself, Mia descended the staircase. Each step was harder than the last, as if something invisible was trying to pull her back, away from that place. The sound of her footsteps echoed distortedly, like a rhythmic, agonizing heartbeat. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, the stone floor opened into a vast underground chamber. The room was illuminated by a faint, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the very walls, as if the house was alive and pulsating around her. In the center of the chamber, there was a dark, deep well, surrounded by symbols Mia couldn't understand. But she knew instinctively that this was the abyss the house fed on, the heart of its evil. Slowly, a figure began to emerge from the shadows near the well. The same figure Mia had seen in her reflection, the shadow that had pursued her from the beginning. But now it was clearer, almost human in appearance. Its eyes glowed with an ancient malevolence, and its presence was suffocating, as if the darkness surrounding it was an extension of itself. "You've finally arrived," the figure whispered, its voice deep and cavernous. "Everyone reaches here eventually. You're part of this now, like all the others." Mia stepped back, but her feet seemed glued to the ground, as if the house itself was holding her there. Her heart raced uncontrollably, and terror rooted itself in her chest like never before. What are you?" she managed to murmur, her voice weak and trembling. The figure stepped closer, and Mia saw its face for the first time. It wasn't human, but a distortion, a grotesque mix of flesh and shadow. Its eyes, black as night, pierced through her, as if it could see every one of her thoughts, every fear, every memory. "I am the house," the figure responded calmly, with a smile that didn't match the horror of its appearance. "I am every soul that has lived here, every pain, every suffering. And now you are part of me too." The words echoed in Mia's mind, and she felt an invisible force pulling her toward the well. Despair consumed her as she tried to resist, but her legs no longer obeyed. The floor seemed to melt beneath her feet, and her vision began to blur once again. The well called to her, and she knew with a terrible certainty that there was no escape. The abyss awaited, and when she fell, she would become one with the house, her soul trapped forever in that infernal cycle. With one final desperate scream, Mia was pulled into the darkness. The abyss consumed Mia, but contrary to her expectations, the darkness wasn't cold or deadly. She floated, as if caught in limbo, suspended between life and death, between the real and the imagined. She felt her body being pulled in opposite directions, her fragmented memories shattering and reforming in nonsensical ways. She no longer knew who she was, what she was, or if she had ever been anything more than a shadow, a lost echo in the depths of that cursed house. At some point, something changed. The darkness around her dissipated, giving way to a familiar environment. She was back in the house, but it wasn't the house she knew. This one seemed newer, more alive, as if time had reversed. The wooden floor was pristine, without the signs of decay that once covered every surface. Sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the rooms in a warm, comforting glow. Mia walked through the halls, confused. Every room was furnished, and the smell of fresh food wafted from the kitchen, as if someone was cooking. For a moment, she almost allowed herself to believe that it had all been a dream, a nightmare, nothing more. But the scars on her mind were too fresh, too deep. She knew something was wrong. A woman appeared in the kitchen. She was young, beautiful, with her hair tied up in a simple bun, wearing a floral apron. When she saw Mia, she smiled as if she knew her. "Ah, you're back," the woman said, her voice soft and welcoming. "It's time for dinner. Come join us." Mia tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come. The woman seemed unaware of her distress and continued preparing the meal. When Mia approached the table, she saw 3 other people sitting there. An older man with stern features and tired eyes, a girl of about 10 with blonde hair and braids, and a young man, perhaps in his 30s, with a friendly appearance but hidden sadness in his gaze. They watched her in silence, as if waiting for her to take her place at the table. Mia felt like an intruder, but at the same time, something inside her told her she knew these people, that she had been with them before. The confused memories continued to echo in her mind, and before she realized it, she was sitting at the table, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Dinner is served," the woman announced, placing a steaming dish in the center of the table. It was a simple meal, meat, potatoes, vegetables, but the smell was irresistible. Everyone began serving themselves, and Mia, hesitant, picked up her fork and tasted the food. The flavor was rich, familiar, but something was wrong. A bitterness, an acidity that intensified with each bite, until the taste became unbearable. Mia looked at the others, but they ate as if nothing was out of the ordinary. When she tried to stand, the older man glared at her with a hard look. "You haven't finished yet," he said, his voice heavy, carrying an unquestionable authority. Mia felt terror rising in her chest. She wanted to leave, wanted to run, but she was trapped. Something prevented her from moving, and the discomfort grew with each passing second. The walls around her began to close in slowly, the sunlight dimmed, and the feeling of being watched, that something terrible was about to happen, became unbearable. Suddenly, the blonde girl began to laugh, a sharp, childish laugh, but filled with a malice that made Mia's blood run cold. "She doesn't know, does she?" the girl said, her eyes gleaming with cruelty. "She still thinks she can leave." The young man beside her sighed sadly. "No one leaves," he said, his voice full of resignation. "We're all part of it now." Mia forced herself to speak, her throat dry and her voice hoarse. "Part of what? What do you want from me?" The woman approached, with a strange smile on her lips. "You already know the answer," she whispered, her face too close, her eyes penetrating directly into Mia's soul. "You are one of us." Suddenly, the scene around her changed again. The once vibrant and alive house began to disintegrate, the walls crumbling into dust, the furniture decaying before her eyes. The faces of the people at the table began to contort, transforming into something grotesque, their expressions of pain and suffering replacing any trace of humanity. Mia stumbled back, tripping over her own feet, as terror consumed every fiber of her being. She tried to run, but the doors were locked, the windows sealed. There was nowhere to go. The voices began to whisper again, now louder, more insistent. "You are part of the house, part of us, forever." With a desperate scream, Mia tried to cover her ears, but it was useless. The voices were inside her mind, eroding her sanity, her sense of identity. She felt the house rooting itself into her being, sucking away her memories, her hopes, until all that remained was the same darkness that had consumed everyone before her. In a brief moment of clarity, she saw her reflection in a broken window. The face staring back at her was no longer her own. It was a blend of the faces of all those who had lived and died in the house. She was the house now, just like they were. There was no escape. There never had been. Mia collapsed to her knees, exhausted, defeated. The house had won. It always wins. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The house remained silent, as if nothing had happened. The outside world continued its indifferent course, while the ancient secrets of the House of Lost Souls buried themselves deeper within its walls. But inside the house, time followed a distorted logic, as if the place existed in a separate dimension where the laws of reality didn't apply. Mia's story became a mere footnote in the whispers of the small town. A young woman gone missing, just another among many. Authorities quickly abandoned the search, convinced that she, like so many others, had simply chosen to disappear, seeking refuge in some distant and anonymous place. Her name began to fade from collective memory, like a shadow that was never fully seen. But the house never forgets. A new family was on their way, a young couple with ambitious plans to restore what they considered a historic gem. Their naive dreams of turning the mansion into a charming bed and breakfast were both ambitious and doomed to fail. They didn't know the stories. They didn't believe the rumors. The legends about the house were just folklore to them, ghost stories told by superstitious locals. There was no curse, just history and potential. That's what they told themselves. When they arrived for the first time, the house was exactly as Mia had last seen it. Worn, decaying, but with a presence that couldn't be ignored. The young couple entered enthusiastically, exploring the rooms as if they could already see the renovations done, the guests staying, the bright future ahead. To them, the air was only heavy with dust. There were no shadows moving on the walls, no voices whispering from dark corners. Not yet. In the first days, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They immediately began working, cleaning, tearing down walls to restore the place. But the house had different plans. And soon, the subtle signs began. The feeling of being watched, noises that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within, objects not being where they should be. Then came the nightmare. First, for the husband. He woke one night in a panic, his breath short, his body drenched in cold sweat. The house seemed alive around him, every shadow on the walls distorted, every sound amplified. He tried to wake his wife, but she was deeply immersed in her own sleep, her face peaceful. But he knew something was wrong. He got up, feeling the oppressive presence of the house with every step, as if the weight of centuries was pressing on his chest. When he reached the living room, he saw the impossible. Mia was there, standing in the middle of the room, not as a ghost, but as someone who had never left, her eyes fixed on him. Her skin was pale, her eyes empty, and her presence felt like an anchor at the bottom of the ocean, holding him down, draining all light and warmth from the room. "You're trapped," she said with a voice that seemed to echo from some distant place. "Just like me." He tried to run, but the house's hallways stretched endlessly. Every door he opened led him back to the same room, to the same encounter with Mia.